Hey everyone, this is my latest in a series of mini lectures that supplement your reading in Kettle. And this week, I want to talk about this term Kettle uses on fuzzy boundaries. So let's get right into that. Okay, so actually, go right to this point down here that I'm highlighting with my little red marker. My purpose with this mini lecture is to supplement Kettle. And at the end of this lecture, I'm going to offer you a couple of books on what serving the public can mean to you in your own practice, because that really is what we're all about. But again, when I say supplement Kettle, don't take this as a substitute for Kettle. Please read the chapter. This this really is designed to pull out some major points that I think are important. Certainly not all of them. Okay, so Kettle has this quote in chapter 5, and he says, public administration's biggest challenge at the beginning of the 21st century was to resolve the fuzzy boundary problem, to develop new theoretical and practical tools for understanding the boundary spanning issues that have become the field's knottiest and most important problems. So, in other words, what he says is public administration faces some important unresolved issues. Second, he says, as an academic field and practice, we have some divergent views, and often consensus is hard to achieve on those views. I've actually had a couple students comment to me on that. Um, and, in a sense, public administration is a large, a large academic field and practice, and sometimes we do get the impression there is no overriding theory. Um, but any approach that we take does have to take into account these four historic traditions of public administration, which Kettle's been talking about through this whole book: Hamiltonianism, Jeffersonianism, Madisonianism, and Wilsonianism. So, two things that I want to say about that. One is, if you understand what those terms really have in mind in a few short sentences, you'll be a hit at social gatherings because you can talk about Hamilton and his emphasis on a strong executive. You can talk about Jefferson and his emphasis on bottom-up governance. You can talk about Madisonianism and his emphasis on balance of power. And you can talk about Wilson and his emphasis on the bureaucracy, the professional bureaucracy. But the second thing is that these traditions really are important thought traditions in public administration. And so all is not lost when people say we don't have an overarching theory. In fact, these are somewhat theoretical. They're really just thought traditions, um, but they're important in public administration. So as a memory aid, you saw this chart before. I gave it to you in a different lecture, but there's a slightly different spin. You'll find this on page 113 of the Kettle text. We know that Wilsonianism is bureaucracy centered. Madisonianism is balance of power centered. Hamiltonianism is centered on a strong executive, and Jeffersonianism is centered on a weak executive. But we'll get to more of this stuff later. Okay, so what is the problem with traditional public administration? But before I get to that, first of all, there are actually a few terms that were not always pejoratives or dirty words. Things like bureaucracy, bureaucrat, agency, government, politics, hierarchy. I mean, people these days, if I went out and used all these terms, people would think I'm, making fun of someone. It really wasn't always that way. And that's important to keep in mind. So, what is the problem of so-called traditional PA, or what some people would call traditional PA? Well, first of all, let's talk about what it is. So, Wilson and Wilsonianism, that tradition emphasizes a politics administration dichotomy, wherein informed policymakers, that is, in Congress, state legislatures, even city councils, come up with needed and clear law and policy with defined outcomes. This is what this policy is supposed to do. These are the outcomes that we're going to have. And then professional bureaucrats with education and training carry out these policies, and they have the discretion to organize the agency in ways that create efficiency in the outputs. And so, therefore, the best organization to carry out these policies that are written by politicians is through a hierarchical bureaucracy. Well, then Hamiltonianism, that tradition emphasizes the primacy of the executive. And so, therefore, we understand that hierarchical bureaucracies are accountable to this executive. And then there's an understood chain of command in that bureaucracy that enforces accountability and efficiency. So, what's the problem? Well, the problem is really a question. The question is this really the way government, or for that matter, businesses really work? You know, are all government outputs a product of function organized and vertically integrated bureaucracies? It's a rhetorical question because the answer is no. That isn't really the way, um, even things that the government pays for are always delivered. So, but even if we accept that government outputs, let's say, are delivered by some kind of hierarchical bureaucracy, the problem is that the bureaucracy, which wasn't always a dirty word, results in what we could call bureaucratic pathologies. Well, what are some of these pathologies? The biggest pathology that people cite is rules. There's always rules. So rules are of utmost importance, and there are exceptions to the rules, but they're very few. So citizens have a hard time understanding the rules, and they can't get results, right? And then employees within the bureaucracy, they're equally frustrated because they're not empowered really to change the procedures or rules. And then managers, if we think about managers in the bureaucracy, they're really little more than what I would call a glorified referee, like a referee in a football game or an umpire in a baseball game. Their job is to make sure the rules are followed and then punish, if you will, the rule breakers, right? 15-yard penalty for holding. You're a rule breaker. So the managers become this glorified referee, whether that's an employee or a citizen. Well, of course, these are caricatures, right, or cartoonish characterizations, but in fact, they're quite popular and they're referenced by people seeking office, by the public, and by the media. So let's move on with more of what Kittle has to say. He talks about implementation. So, what is the problem of implementation? He cites this book by Pressman and Vildovsky that was written way back in the early 1970s, and the title of that book was um, Implementation: How Great Expectations in Washington Are Dashed in Oakland, or Why It's Amazing That Federal Programs Work at All. Well, so what is the problem with implementation? Well, one of the problems is that what we think of as federal programs, they're not necessarily administered by this classic functional bureaucracy. And by these so-called bureaucrats. In other words, it's a balance of power or a Madisonian issue combined with a bottom-up governance or Jeffersonian issue. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. There are federal programs, for example, Social Security, which is administered completely by the federal government. And if you have a Social Security problem, let's say, there's going to be a local office somewhere. If you live in a large city, there's going to be a local Social Security office, and you can go talk to a representative, an employee of the federal government in the Social Security office. If you're a veteran and you get your health care through the VA healthcare system, that's a regional uh, office of a larger government, or not, I don't want to say government, I want to say federal government bureaucracy. But those are kind of exceptional because typically some federal programs might be administered by state agencies. For example, unemployment insurance is a federal program administered through state employment offices. Medicaid is partially paid for by the federal government, partially paid for by states, but administered by states. Uh, by I live in Nebraska, so it's the Health and Human Services Department. They administer Medicaid. Um, they might be local agencies for programs like housing. So there's an Omaha housing agency. Well, every large city has a housing agency, right? There's rural towns with housing agencies. But how are the people selected to work in those offices? They're actually local hires, but they're administering a federal program. Um, There might be for-profit businesses administering uh, federal programs. So, for example, loan guarantee programs like student loans and VA mortgages. These really are administered primarily through commercial banks. Um, there might be insurance companies for programs like Medicare. If you are a Medicare patient, typically your benefits are going to go lots of times through an insurance company, a large insurance company. So um, this is one of the problems with implementation, whereas people might think, oh, this is just a government program, whatever they mean by government, it's not. And just because I have a military background, I threw this last quote in here just to confuse you more. In every state of the union, there are men and women today wearing uniforms that say U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force on them, but they're also state employees getting part of their pay from the state, part of their pay from the U.S. government, working on equipment that belongs to the Army or the Air Force, but that the governor controls sometimes through an employee that he has called an adjutant general who holds some federal rank like brigadier general and some state rank like lieutenant colonel. I'm sorry, I said that different. A federal rank like lieutenant colonel and a state rank like brigadier general, and they're sometimes different. Um, so the issue with implementation is that it is not often administered through this single functional top-down bureaucracy. It's actually administered through a variety of levels of government and through a variety of sectors. And if that weren't enough, give you some more stuff to think about. We see a couple of balance of power or political issues. Again, Madison. We see these every day. Institutions themselves, such as, let's talk about some at the national level, the Foreign Policy Institution, which probably consists of people that work in the State Department and other people interested in foreign policy. The Defense Institution. What is the Defense Institution? That might be the Department of Defense, the separate services. It might be companies in the defense industry, like Boeing and Lockheed. Um, that they kind of act as an institution. The U.S. Senate as an institution, the U.S. House of Representatives, the White House. I left out the courts, but the courts as an institution. Each of these institutions have interests, and institutions themselves are often composed of formal and informal rules that sometimes you have to actually research to find out what those informal rules are, but these rules often guide how they respond to suggestions about policy. And then street level bureaucrats, which is a term I love that was coined by this author named Michael Lipsky. Street level bureaucrats create de facto policy every day while doing their job. So the easiest example to think of is a police officer. A lot of police departments in the United States have been criticized, and in many cases rightly so, have been criticized for example, doing more traffic stops on African Americans than on white Americans. Well, the question is, does that create a de facto policy? And that's not written down somewhere. And if you interviewed the police chief of that city, she or he would say, no, that is not my policy at all. But if officers are doing it and it becomes a practice, is that a policy that has been created by so-called street level bureaucrats? Just something to think about. So what? So what does this all mean? What it means is that, we're not the first people to notice these problems. Kettle's not the first person to notice these problems. A lot of people have noticed them and then attempted to resolve them. But the way they resolve them actually has to do with the tradition that they're coming from. So if you kind of hold a Wilsonian bureaucracy-centered approach along with a Hamiltonian strong executive approach, you might be a fan of reinventing government from the standpoint of procedural reforms. In other words, you're saying that the problem is the bureaucracy itself. The problem is that the executive isn't strong enough. So let's reinvent government to make procedures better so that we can be more efficient, right? What if you say, yes, the bureaucracy is important and it's a problem, but I don't really think, I come at governance from a strong executive, I come at it from a weak executive. standpoint, like Jefferson. Well, reinventing government also strives for employee empowerment and customer service. So this is bottom up. This is top down. What if you kind of accept what Madison has to say about bureaucratic politics, about balance of power? Well, you can design a public management system that actually helps you implement things with this balance of power approach. And this is where institutionalism comes into play. Finally, if you're a Jeffersonian and you really believe in the weak executive with bottom up implementation, and you believe in Madison's theory of balance of power, then you're really going to talk about network theory. And here we talk about things like, um, what does your city do about its homelessness issue? It's not a government program, but your city might actually pay money to deal with homelessness. But where are homeless people housed? They might be housed in shelters that are run by, religious and non-religious agencies who get money from the local government, from the state government, from the federal government. So, you might talk about how governance is done through networks. So, where does this leave us? I just want to leave you with a couple books that might be interesting to you because a couple students have asked me, and I just wanted to recommend a couple. One is kind of an old book, is written in 1995, so already it's more than 20 years old. But it's by Mark Moore, and it's called Creating Public Value, uh, Strategic Management in Government. This is a book famous because Mark Moore came up with something called the strategic triangle for public value. But what he's writing about is the manager. So he really is a managerialist. And what he says is that managers do make a difference. They do that by recognizing that in the public sector, their job is to create what he calls public value. And then he goes about in the book discussing how managers can do that. Um, I think a lot of you would really connect with this book. It's really a interesting book. It's an easy read, and I think Mark Moore has a lot to say about how managers in the public sector can make a difference. Then a second book, which kind of takes a different approach altogether, is by Janet Denhart and Robert Denhart, and they call the book The New Public Service: Serving, Not Steering. And the Denharts are critical of what's called New Public Management, and they're critical of what's called Reinventing Government, which was a book by Osborne and Gabler. They say that Osborne and Gabler are on the wrong path of, referring to citizens as customers, for example. And so what the Denharts are instead suggesting is that we're all in this together, pretty much. I mean, government is not something external to us. It is something we are part of. We form governments. And so therefore, those of us who work in the public sector, we have the opportunity to serve the public, to serve our fellow citizens. And so these books kind of have different approaches, but they both have this theme, which is, where does that leave us? So I hope this mini lecture has been helpful as you read the Kettle text and as you respond to the questions this week. I'll look forward to your discussions, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.